So, Moab. Anybody know where Moab, Alabama is? Near Birmingham, I think, between here and Birmingham. Well, Moab has another definition besides a city or a town in Alabama, and that's the Massive Ordnance Air Blast Program, which just happened to be one of the programs that our next speaker helped put together when he was a Air Force Acquisition Research and Development Officer. He did this program when he was in the active Air Force. After that, he was a civilian in the intelligence community, working in space systems. And then he was a professional staff on the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. Then after that, he became a senior executive service in the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Space Policy. And there he has the responsibilities of ensuring the warfighters the benefits of space capabilities. And he's also working the Department of Defense's activities with the international space community. So he's going to talk to us about national security in space. He's going to talk for a little bit, and then he's going to take some questions and answers. Oh, I should tell you his name, shouldn't I? Stephen Kitay. Stephen Kitay. Thank you, Stephen.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for that introduction. What a great discussion this morning. That was just really inspiring for me to hear the passion out there in this room, and that is a really important group to talk to. The User Advisory Group, as they had mentioned, advises the Vice President and the members of the Cabinet, and I would say definitely stay engaged and think about it as they talked about it across the space continuum from national security to civil to commercial, and really think about our entire space program. So I believe we're really at a historic moment for our nation's space program. And I say this because our country's leadership recognizes the importance of the space domain and is taking bold action to further unlock and protect space for our security and scientific exploration and economic vitality. And as you just heard from the last panel, the President reestablished the National Space Council, which is being actively led by the Vice President. And the focus is on ensuring U.S. leadership in space. And the title of this symposium is really perfect for that. It's Galvanizing U.S. Leadership. So before I had the honor of taking this job, I supported our Congress, and I also saw firsthand there the passion that many members had on supporting this objective as well. This group also knows the technology advancements, the plans for exploration, the growing international activity, and the billions of dollars in private investment for new and expanding commercial missions in space. So our national strategies recognize this environment, and the President's national security strategy and national strategy for space, as a result, state that unfettered access to and freedom to operate in space is of vital interest for our nation, and it's vital for advancing our national security, our scientific achievement, and the economic prosperity of our nation. Now, unfortunately, this vital interest is threatened as potential adversaries are actively developing systems that could be used to deny us the benefits of space in crisis or conflict. And this could pose severe damage, not just to our security, but of that of our friends and allies, and also our economy. And indeed, it's the global economy. So stop for a minute, and we spoke about this a little bit in the last panel of the GPS system. And think about the effect of if an adversary was able to knock out a significant portion of this constellation or the associated ground infrastructure, whether through kinetic, cyber, or other means. The U.S. military relies on GPS to shoot and maneuver. And what many Americans may not appreciate is how dependent we are for GPS from everything from banking to agriculture and, of course, to getting an Uber ride. Because of the threatening actions of our competitors and potential adversaries, we have now recognized space as a warfighting domain. But what does space as a warfighting domain mean? This means that we do not view space as a sanctuary. We are preparing for war that may extend into or even start in space. But make no mistake that this is about national security, and any potential conflict is about here on Earth. And as the commander of U.S. Strategic Command has stated, there's no such thing as a space war. It's all just war, but now extending into space. As Admiral Ellis mentioned earlier, as the technology changes and the world grows ever more complex, the character of war is changing with it. So let me go back in time with you. As the U.S. military has been in space for over 70 years, even our earliest efforts in space supported defense activities, going back to the great Dr. von Braun, after whom this symposium is named, and who worked on rockets and missiles for the U.S. Army. There's also another program, the Corona satellite program, which is an engineering marvel that launched in 1959, and it dropped canisters of film from reconnaissance satellites in space that the canisters were then recovered by aircraft and provided intelligence behind the Iron Curtain and deep into the Soviet Union. Since those early days, we have continued to invest in our national security space program. Our military, led by the United States Air Force, continually brought new capabilities and worked with the Army and the Navy and the warfighting commands to integrate space with the terrestrial warfighters. This includes GPS, strategic and tactical communications, intercontinental and theater missile warning, weather data collection, and intelligence and surveillance with a joint partnership with the National Reconnaissance Office. In short, space enhances the lethality of our terrestrial forces. And this was put on display in the first Gulf War, which has been called the First Space War. And I'll note that at this time we had a U.S. Space Command, a warfighting command focused on integrating space operations. And I'll come back to this later. That enhancement of our forces then and over time did not go unnoticed. China and Russia in particular saw how the power of space transformed American warfighting capabilities. And in turn, China and Russia are significantly advancing development of space services for their own forces, and they are also developing anti-satellite weapons which could be used against U.S. and allied forces in a conflict. China and Russia have also increased focus on establishing operational forces designed to integrate attacks against space systems and services with military operations in other domains. The threats are real and growing. So what next? We are taking a strategy-driven approach to space as a warfighting domain, and we are aligned in execution. We are implementing the strategies that our leadership has set out, and we have whole-of-government strategies in the form of the National Security Strategy, the National Strategy for Space, and then within the department, we have the National Defense Strategy. Additionally, Deputy Secretary of Defense Shanahan also recently provided a report to Congress, referred to as the Section 1601 report, which outlines our approach to space in the Department of Defense. As we build on these national strategies, our approach to space in the department is really framed by the National Defense Strategy. The National Defense Strategy prioritizes the demands of great power competition and calls on us to compete, deter, and win through 3 lines of effort. Those lines of effort are to increase the lethality of our forces, to strengthen international partnerships and to attract new partners, and to reform the department's business practices to ensure we are the best possible steward of the taxpayer resources. The department's objectives in space are to deter malicious activity and keep the peace, to protect our vital interests, and to deploy next-generation capabilities to support the warfighter. In this regard, our approach is multi-dimensional and time-phased. I can tell you firsthand that there's a strong cross-functional team under the guidance of the Deputy Secretary that is moving with purpose and urgency on a range of critical topics, including space organization, policies, strategies, doctrine, capabilities, and workforce development. President Trump has provided the strategic vision and the direction for the establishment of a Space Force as a sixth branch of our armed forces. This will be a force that's focused on space and the space needs of our combatant commands. This force will train and grow national security space professionals and will develop the doctrine and capabilities needed to enable the joint warfighter and ensure we can fight and win should warfare extend into space. The executive branch will request the legislative authority for a Space Force from Congress in February. However, the department is not waiting until legislation is negotiated and passed. We are moving out now and within current executive branch authorities. This includes developing the warfighting operations structure through the establishment of U.S. Space Command as a new joint warfighting command with the leadership that has the necessary authorities to conduct space operations and oversee forces to address the 21st century challenges we face. We are also establishing a space development agency, which will be focused on bold breakthroughs and accelerating the deployment of new capabilities. The department will harness a blend of commercial and government technology and will focus on rapid prototyping, experimentation, and collaboration with key allies and partners. History has shown us that strong technical competence and an empowered leadership combined with a concentration of resources can produce exceptional results, and we intend to apply these lessons learned. Our space vision includes a focus on persistent global surveillance enabled by artificial intelligence and machine learning, responsive and resilient infrastructures, cross-domain networked command, control, and communications, and development of deterrent capabilities, to name a few. Speaking of deterrence, let me be clear, we do not seek war in space, just as we do not seek war here on Earth. But we will take the appropriate actions to deter and defeat any aggressive acts to our national interests, whether they're here on land or 22,000 miles above the Earth. Indeed, our strategies state that we will respond to threats to our vital interest at a time, place, manner, and domain of our choosing. We're working on concepts to project strength, communicate resolve, and demonstrate capabilities to deny benefit of hostile action, and in response impose cost, and improve the attribution of hostile acts in order to enhance our deterrence posture. As Secretary Mattis has stated, quote, "Our military's role is to keep the peace for one more year, one more month, one more week, one more day, to ensure our diplomats who are working to solve problems do so from a position of strength in giving our allies confidence in us. This confidence is underpinned by the assurance that our military will win should diplomacy fail," end quote. So in closing, some may say why? Why do we need to implement these ambitious space reform initiatives? Why do we need to move with such urgency? The answer is because the threat has a vote. Great power competition is now the primary focus of U.S. national security, and we cannot afford to lose space in this competition. Space power is integral to our national security, our economy, and our way of life. So for those who say, can we afford to change, I ask, can we afford not to? Thank you, and I'm happy to take a few questions.
Hey, thank you for being here today. So from the small town that I'm from, ever since SPD4 was talked about earlier in the year, we've had rumblings about Marines dropping in from space and doing orbital deployment and things like that. And from the other side of the aisle, we've had a lot of people talking about their belief that space should, as our current space treaties say, remain a place where weapons don't have any part in the conversation. It's a peaceful place for all mankind. I think here we all could probably agree that our national security interests, our satellite networks, and our capabilities be protected. As we move forward, just like the conversation we had before about NASA staying on message, how do you maintain the facts about what it is that whatever the Space Force becomes? How do you maintain the message that it's not Marines dropping from space, but it is just protecting our assets? And how do you keep the truth out there and fight the misinformation that has come up around Space Force?
Thank you for that question. You're right, there is a lot of misinformation out there, and it can be, the butt of late night jokes. And the fact of the matter is, I think, like you're saying, people don't necessarily understand what we're talking about. They don't understand how these satellites are critical to our national security and our way of life. And this is not, like you said, about Marines dropping out of space or fighting aliens or X-wing TIE fighters. This is about protecting our national interests and looking at it in a multi-domain warfare perspective. And it's in response to the threat. And we see those threats, and we have to make sure that we're prepared for it. And that gets into this elements of deterrence, where we have to look at it in our overall deterrence posture. Where we're trying to deter conflict and demonstrate and have peace through strength. The best way, I think, is to continue the education process, and things like what happened earlier this week, where the Vice President led the National Space Council, and our leaders talked about it and had expert witnesses come and give perspectives, helps elevate this and put information out into the public on what we're actually talking about. I think we still have a long way to go to educate the public. People, I think if you kind of look at space over time, people understood NASA and going to the moon, and now we're at a phase where I think the public is really starting to understand commercial space more, because what's happening with companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and other activities that are now bringing commercial space much more in view of the public. And I think that next step is national security space, and what this means to our troops in harm's way and our own country's very well-being. So we've got a ways to go. I think activities like this help us, get out there. My understanding is historically this has been more a civil-focused forum, and myself and then Mitch is going to be speaking next, who's also he's in the Office of Secretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, so he's going to be speaking more about technology, getting out into forums beyond our national security circles to talk about this. So, thank you.
Yes, actually, I wanted to ask this question at the previous panel, but it's regards to grand strategy and what are the geopolitical implications? 50 years ago when we had the Apollo program, it was in the context of the Cold War. We were competing against the Russians, which were an existential threat. And because of that, we had a lot more money being thrown at the program, and we tolerated a lot more risk than we do now. Now, when we see a rise of threats from China and Russia, do you see an increase in funding going towards space and an increase in risk tolerance?
So in last year's budget, in the FY19 budget that went 6 months ago, there was an increase of $8 billion in the National Security Space Program over the 5-year defense program planning cycle. So we did see an increase last year where, like you're saying, we've needed to address the challenges of great power competition and invest in our space activities in the department. I can't speak to this year's budget. We're in the midst of that and pulling that together to then be delivered to Congress in February. But I can say that space has been very much recognized as a priority domain across our country, as well as within our national security apparatus, which is why we're taking the activities that we are.
Hi, Steve. This is Mike Fox with Raytheon. I did have the privilege to attend the meeting on Tuesday, and I was struck by just how much is taking place in order for the Space Force, to happen. But one of the things as a company so vested in space and in your mission and in NASA's mission and NOAA's space mission is we want to make sure that there isn't so much attention drawn on how the bureaucracy gets resolved and improved that we lose sight of the many programs that we currently work with you, and basically what could happen is the funding needed to restructure is taken away from the programs that we already work on or would like to be working on. And how do you address that the importance in order to increase the funding at the same time as you change the bureaucracy?
So it's a great point, and it's something that we all recognize that we do have to make sure that this is not just about reorganizing and moving chairs on the deck. This is about fundamental change and bringing the capabilities necessary to the warfighter and how we're structured and focused to do it. So one of the aspects that the leadership has been very clear to us is that throughout this process, and as we change and focus our activities, to make sure that we never have any impact on the critical capabilities that the warfighter and our nation relies upon today. So we will be doing this this change in a very measured and deliberate fashion with taking those things into account. But as you say, make sure that we're actually getting at the fundamental aspects that we need to address while we're doing it.
Hi, Jeff Faust, Space News. You talked earlier about educating people about misperceptions about the Space Force. There's also the issue of educating members of Congress who are going to have to vote on authorizing the Space Force next year. What's your feel for the prospects of being able to get that through next year, especially if either the House or Senate flips party control?
I would just say that from my time on Capitol Hill, where I was up there about a year and a half ago, and I was there for about 5.5 years as a professional staff member on the House Armed Services Committee. And what I saw from the members was just a deepening understanding of the importance of space to our national security, as well as a deepening understanding of the threats that we're facing in those domains. And unfortunately, a lot of that information can be classified. So we're working to make sure that we educate Congress and the American people more about the serious nature of those threats and the importance of space. So I think it's going to be an important discussion. As you said, we'll deliver our proposal for where we're going in space, including the legislative authority for a Space Force with next year's budget request. And I think it's going to be an exciting and interesting discussion. Yes.
You briefly mentioned commercial space. Should a cislunar economy develop, are there considerations within the development of Space Force to protect that economy, much like our Navy protects ocean lanes?
So that's a great question, and one that we're really, we talk about with our strategies, because as I had mentioned, one of our objectives is to deter malicious activity and protect our vital interests. And thinking about space insofar as how we think about the Navy, insofar as protecting those lanes of communication and commerce is something that we are working in our strategies to further develop and make sure we account for, because as you're saying, this is a critical element of our overall space program and of our country. So that and how we address that as is an important aspect of how we're thinking about going forward.
Your last question here.
Tom Martin, Aerojet Rocketdyne. There seems to be a potential for a growing dichotomy between leveraging commercial investment and technology versus space as increasingly being a warfighting domain. And so has the department thought about, one, the potential risk of diverging objectives and requirements as space for the DoD becomes more about warfighting? And then also, is the department looking at how economic risk factors are factored into the overall risk posture of how you're approaching space?
So I would say that our goal is to not have them diverge, but to actually converge more. And we are looking to leverage the benefits of the commercial industry. We see that innovation happening out there, the investment that has great benefit for our national security. And we're trying to make sure that we take advantage of it. Insofar as the economic aspect, I would offer to think about it more in a way of safety and stability, and the fact that, as I had mentioned, we're seeing those threats evolve, and we want to make sure as a country we are able to address them. And I would think that that would provide and we need to think about it insofar as how we think about the other domains as not increasing the instability and safety, but actually working to provide enhanced safety and stability for the reasons that you suggest. So it creates the elements of a vibrant commercial infrastructure as well as supporting our overall national security.